Let's dive in. Just to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. We welcome you to join us today. My name is Jason Ledley, Director of Operations at LabKey based in the UK. And firstly, a really big thank you to everybody for carving out time in their day and joining us today. It's great to have you with us as always. Today's webinar is a first in a series of webinars which we've made intentionally shorter and hopefully to make it easier for you to join us throughout your working day. Today's webinar discusses strategies for a growing lab with a nod to sample management. And really for us, there are two main goals here. Firstly, to share our collective insights gained from professional and personal experience together with the findings of research that we've undertaken at LabKey within this research space, and also to share learned expertise from working closely with people like yourself and the research organizations that you represent that we can learn from. And really, secondly, our main goal is to hopefully provide you with some solutions to the challenges which you face every day in your research environment. Throughout the webinar, feel free, please, to ask us questions. I will be here to facilitate and we'll collate those questions and we'll tackle those at the back end of the webinar. Because it's short, we want to try and get through as much content as we can today. And so without further ado, I shall hand over to our very own domain expert who's presenting today on the strategies for a growing lab, Hannah Brakke. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, I'm Hannah Brakke. I have been an immunologist and a data scientist in my previous life before joining LabKey. For about 10 years, I was in both the infectious disease space as well as the CAR T-cell immunotherapy space. I have experience designing and managing laboratory research databases, but I also have a lot of experience in a growing lab, as I'm sure many of you do as well. And so, as Jason mentioned, I'm here to sort of share that experience as being part of a team that grew from 2 people to over 12 in a matter of a couple of years, and then being part of some other larger growing laboratories as well. So generally, when we think of samples in the lab, there are 3 main steps that we can highlight pretty easily: collection, experiment, and reporting. But if you're joining this webinar, you probably already know that this depiction is far too simple of what actually happens between collection and reporting of data. So for any given sample, you probably see something a little bit more like this, where you have collection around the sample, transporting the sample, receiving the sample into the lab, processing, experimentation, and then cleaning of the data with analysis and QC, and then finally reporting. And even with these sort of additional steps, I think this is probably still far too simple in a lot of the cases and not capturing the nuances of sample management. And so in a growing lab, this can become even more complex. Your handful of samples can turn into dozens or hundreds, depending on what type of lab you're in. Your experiments can become more diverse, and the overall workflow becomes much more complicated to manage. At any given point in this diagram, there can be opportunities for mistakes. Even when tracking in something like paper or Excel, teams can run into potential errors in this process. Typos, sample misplacement, confusion on what steps should be done when, and other things along those lines. Additionally, having this data collected in disparate systems can also make analysis more challenging, which can ultimately delay reporting. It can also mean duplicative work or even forgetting to analyze a sample in an experiment if it's not being tracked properly. And so as a lab grows, it's important to make sure that you've got some basic strategies in place to build a scalable, sustainable system that really sets the team up for success. Given that, my first strategy for a growing lab is always going to be flexibility. As you get more samples, add more processes and experiments, and hopefully more staff, adapting to the changing environment is key. So the first tip here is really to evaluate often. Look at your processes and resources. Revisit your SOPs. Are they still working at your new scale, or do you need to adjust those? Do you have enough space? Do you have enough staff and equipment to help accommodate the growth of the lab? And how can you make process improvements, or what new resources do you need to really support your growing team? By taking the time to evaluate and reflect on the lab, you really provide yourself with an opportunity to prepare the team for what's ahead and stay organized. Also, stay engaged with your team. Foster a culture of continuous improvement. By actually getting feedback on what's working and what's not working from the people doing the work, you can empower your team to embrace growth and feel like a part of the improvement process. Top-down decisions tend to work nominally, but really sort of that bottom-up approach will help everybody feel like they're part of the team and active in making those changes. And all teams work differently. So check the temperature of the people in your lab. Do folks prefer to give written feedback, speak about it privately, or share in like a working session? Feel out different approaches and see what combinations work as the best method of engagement for your team. And use a sample management system that supports flexible working environments and reliable data capture. Really like pick tools that are going to grow with you and work with you. Pick a sample management tool that supports flexibility in adding samples and new workflow and new assay data as you continue to grow. Doing this will help avoid migration in the long run. The second strategy we have is to plan for the sample information you need to capture for accurate sample tracking. It's important to spend some time thinking about this as your lab grows, as the data may end up changing over time. Firstly, make it relevant. Only capture data that's necessary for your work. If you're asking scientists to collect unnecessary data about samples, it will certainly take more time, but it also may devalue the data that's really important to you and your workflows. And also customize the data if you can, tied to your sample receipt and processing, and emphasize which data is critical and which is just nice to have. Keep it simple. Combine like data and label it appropriately. If you can create a single entry form for sample types versus a whole bunch of different forms, it will help you scale as the number of samples and sample types grow and avoid confusion on which form a person needs to use in which scenario. I've actually done that, so I really highly recommend it. Labeling is also key, both for users now and users later. I always think like if what I'm doing now will be able to be understood by a new lab member in 3 years from now. And draw it out. How are your samples getting generated? Are you receiving them from an outside institution? Are you generating them in-house? Is it a combination of the two? As a visual person, I always think capturing this representation of the workflow of samples is really key. It can help you understand where best to capture the right metadata and how it will work in the lab. And then lastly, create templates or standardized forms. Make data entry really easy for people. From a data science standpoint, even if teams are spending a little bit more time up front trying to standardize these columns and the way data is captured, it can make downstream analytics and sample tracking much easier. And thirdly, don't let your freezers get out of control. Being a part of a couple different rapidly growing labs, I know what it's like to try and implement a storage solution midway through a big project or through the year. And people tend to resist. They feel like it slows down their work and makes it more cumbersome than it tends to be worth. But trust me, there's nothing like doing a big freezer defrost and finding mouse livers stuck in the ice. And yes, that is an example that has happened to me. And so I highly recommend finding a freezer management solution. And the way you can start with that is really by keeping the naming consistent. So scaling to more freezers will be easier. You can even start small. Start by consistently naming the racks, boxes, and other storage components in your freezer. As you move from 1-80 to 5 or 10 or half a dozen, it will be much easier to find samples later. Establish guidelines on how samples should be stored. Do you want to maximize space or compartmentalize for easier access? And really, this is about thinking, should all of the samples of a certain type be in one freezer or a certain rack or on a certain shelf? Or do you want to fill boxes consecutively to maximize your space? By communicating clear and easy guidelines, the team can spend more time on the science and less time rummaging through freezers. And capture your storage accurately in a sample management system. Track what's relevant to your team. Look at these systems and really pick something that will be able to accurately reflect your physical storage, and you'll get more buy-in from your team and they'll be more likely to use it. And standardized lab work. Another strategy that growing labs are likely to start doing in times of big growth is the standardization of lab work. It doesn't mean production line efficiency, and it doesn't have to be scary, but even small standardization practices can increase productivity. Capture processing workflows and SOPs to help reduce mistakes. By taking a look at these workflows typically done in the lab, like thawing samples or counting cells, and making standard workflows around those and training the staff appropriately, we can provide tools to help increase efficiency. If you create SOPs then around these workflows and train team members on what to do when something goes wrong, you can even improve the reproducibility of results and capture where processes are most often going awry. Standardize data capture for experiments for easy analysis and reporting. If all of your experimental data is in the same expected format and stored in the same place, you can spend less time on the mining, cleaning, and analysis of data and more time on experimentation. And create consistency around data capture. Having a single source of truth means less redundancy in missing data. If you have to search for an old lab member's 5 different notebooks to find out where their samples are stored in the lab, you're much more likely to end up wasting time or just decide to rerun the experiment. But by housing sample information, processing workflows, and data and its storage all in one place, it can become fairly easy to find that legacy data. Ideally, before a big cycle of growth, you can start implementing change management and preparing for what's ahead. So in order to do this, start out by being realistic. Understand the limitations of the resources you have and adapt as the workload increases. Are you limiting the samples you can receive because you risk issues with integrity or because the lab doesn't have enough equipment? Set expectations with stakeholders on what you'll need in order to succeed and meet their targets. Plan ahead, hire and train staff, finalize SOPs, purchase equipment, and really plan for big growth. Of course, not every group has the luxury of doing this, but finding a tool that helps track current work can provide valuable insight into current capacity constraints. And again, empower your staff to share improvement ideas and feedback. Create this culture of growth and flexibility in the lab. If leaders are sharing the why behind decisions and regularly are asking for feedback and staff input, teams can feel part of the solution and make some big impacts in productivity. And again, find a tool that helps track this lab work and does that record keeping for you. If a system is supporting sample tracking and experiments, as well as maintaining audit records, this will help down the line with any troubleshooting, paper writing, or even staff turnover. And lastly, we're going to give you one more strategy of researching sample management systems. We're often way too busy to make time for this research, but it's really important to pick a tool that's going to be right for your team. And it's something that you'll want to use because it's likely a tool that you're going to be using for a while. So when you're doing this, consider positive and negative aspects of your legacy system and use that as a guide for research. Determine and document these must-have features. Consider what you're using now. What are things that are working? Where are the pain points in your current systems? Write them down, gain a consensus from the team, and document this list of must-have versus nice-to-have features and what might be sort of an eventual thing that you would use. This can help you whittle down to a list of core products that will really work for you and your team. And look for a tool that will allow for flexibility and further growth. Think what you need now and what you'll need in a year or even in 5 years from now. That ensures that you're not spending a ton of time and money later on looking for another system. And get team members involved. Evaluate the features, demo the products, and choose something that they're really excited to use. Once you've set some time to investigate this, really have people dive in and test out the system with their own data. Nothing is better than being hands-on to help the decision-making process. So with all of that said, LabKey has created a web-based sample management product that is flexible, easy to use, and really designed to scale with growing labs. It's designed for use in the lab. By providing a task-based workflow tool, teams can map processes and collaborate all in one place. Sample Manager also provides reporting tools to help monitor lab work and sample tracking quickly and easily. We've specifically designed Sample Manager to be intuitive and easy to use. We want scientists to easily get started with minimal setup time. Since the application is cloud first, there's also no IT support required to get going. It's also very flexible. We have unlimited custom user-defined fields that can allow any type of science and any growing lab to really easily capture the data around samples, the sample sources, and any type of assay data. And because of this flexibility, it can scale very easily as well by adding new freezers, users, workflows, samples, sources, all of that as you need without a bunch of administrative overhead. And as I mentioned before, this really was designed by scientists for scientists. And so the goal is to help you do work in your lab. So there are 4 main components of Sample Manager that I want to cover today. The first is sample tracking, and Sample Manager can help these growing labs stay on top of samples with the sample tracking tool. Capturing the chain of custody and a detailed history for each sample helps enable easy auditing and troubleshooting as you scale. Customizable metadata supports different types of labs capture the exact information that's relevant to them. And we don't limit the addition of custom fields, helping labs track samples as they grow. Our flexible lineage tool also gives growing labs insight into the complete history of a sample and its derivatives, meaning you don't lose track of a sample's context, even as the lab grows and workflows become more complicated. We also have a workflow management tool to help capture the lab's work. Labs have the flexibility to create custom workflows to match their processes and create templates for standardized work. Once a template is created, it can be used day after day with new samples or altered as your lab's needs change and grow. It can help support team collaboration by assigning workflows or even individual tasks to different team members, adding notifications to collaborators or team leads for ultimate visibility into the process. And it's easy to see where resources may be thin by managing workflows in the laboratory-wide view of ongoing work, allowing you to notice bottlenecks and adjust as needed. And know what's in your freezers with our new freezer management tool. It's customizable to match the storage you have in the lab and flexible enough to grow with you. You can create your own freezer hierarchy, box and plate names, and even customize how you want your columns and rows to be labeled. By tracking the storage and movement of samples in and out of the freezer, you can make sure you have enough storage capacity to accommodate your growing team and plan ahead as needed. And keeping track of the sample amount, freeze thaw count, and location also means you can increase the integrity of data collection and ensures tracking is accurate and reflective of what's happening in the lab. And lastly, Sample Manager can also help standardize experimental data and keep all of your data in one place with our assay tool. Keep track of all the runs performed in an assay by viewing the aggregate data in Sample Manager. Never lose track of what assays have been performed and which haven't. Our customizable fields allow for virtually any results to be uploaded to automatically link with samples, providing the flexibility you need as you grow. And stay updated on lab progress by tracking status of ongoing experiments using workflow and assay together. So with all of that, I really hope you'll be able to use these strategies for your team, and you really end up finding a tool that works for you, whether or not it's Sample Manager.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great. Perfect. And a great presentation, but also great to hear some of the best practices from somebody who's actually been there. And I could hear the chuckle in your voice of kind of saying, look, I know this, I've been there, it's problematic, here are the solutions. So that was great. And I think some important themes came through there, from the flexibility, which is important, of course, to maintain consistency, but having something that can grow and evolve with time as your lab grows. The ability, I think, to capture the right information. Obviously, data is king, the right sample data, metadata, lab data, etc. And location. I think, making sure your freezer is under control is what I also took away from that. So that's great. Thank you so much. We do have questions which are filtered through. So if I could just take a couple of moments, I'm mindful of the time. So we've got about 6 minutes here. So starting in the order they were received, really. We've got here is, could you confirm that Sample Manager is CFR Part 11 compliant?
Started talking with my mute on. Yes, it is Part 11 compliant. With our timeline tool that we didn't really talk about today, we do have detailed audit records of everything that happens within the system attached to the person and the user who made those changes as well.
Great. I know it's a question we often get. Okay, does Sample Manager have an API, and how can it be used? Can it be used for querying or for instrument connectivity?
So we are offering an API right now for Sample Manager. Mostly it will be used, our current functionality is for querying, although we do plan to help support teams in instrument connectivity if they need to, as they grow, obviously.
Great. Another one's just come through here. Can you update the status of multiple samples in a workflow at once?
Yes, so we have designed this tool in both inside the workflow tool, but also throughout the application to do both sort of single action edits and updates, as well as bulk action edits and updates. And so that means that you can select a single sample and do things to it. You can select a multiple set of samples in the UI and do that as well in workflow. Or you can choose to sort of do those updates in a file, and we accept that file import and we'll update the samples for you there too.
Great, thank you. So you talked about workflow, you talked about like connectivity with an API. So really on the theme of automation, does Sample Manager integrate with a scanner for barcoding?
Yes, so we accept just how normal scanners would work with the kind of like a text search. We do support that currently and actually have plans to enhance that functionality this year by allowing for multiple barcode searches at once and sort of really helping labs do the work in that way as well.
Correct. And in terms of keeping control of your freezer, how does Sample Manager handle the disposal of samples?
Yeah, so that's a really great point. We have designed Sample Manager to be sample centric, which means that you can register and create samples before they've even arrived into your lab and track those in workflow. Once they've arrived, or once you have an idea of where they're going to be stored, you can then add them to a freezer solution. And once that you go through your process and do your experiments and consume the sample, you can delete the sample from the freezer system, but still maintain the record of the sample, which really allows for sort of holistic sample tracking and not having to dig through audit logs 3 years down the road when you're looking for what happened to a certain sample.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned that Sample Manager is cloud first deployment, but are there options to have this on-premise if needed, if, for example, security was a concern within my organization?
Yes. So as you said, Jason, we are cloud first because we understand that not a lot of organizations want to get IT involved or want to have to go through that overhead. And so we provide that as our first option. But if teams are interested in an on-premise solution, we have options for that as well.
Cool. And we welcome those discussions, and please feel free to contact us, and we'll explain that in an email that you'll get after the end of this webinar. How can we trial Sample Manager?
So check your email as we put here. We're going to send you the Sample Manager tour link, and I think it's actually even been added to the chat. And there will be a place where you can ask for a demo as well. And in that, you can have the opportunity to talk to us and then subsequently sort of trial that environment.
And the last question that's just come through is very similar to that. How can we discuss this further if we need to contact you, which I think you've already covered there. One thing that may be worth just touching on in the minute or so we have, Hannah, is kind of the roadmap and our intention to build this out over time for the rest of this year, and any comments you may have about the evolution of Sample Manager.
Yep, absolutely. So as I mentioned, for this year, we're focused on sort of increasing barcoding support, thinking about not only 2D scanning, but RFID scanning as well, and how that might help provide better solutions for these larger labs, maybe already growing or continuing to grow labs. We're also providing some additional support around aliquoting and naming around those aliquots. We do currently have a solution for that, but I think we can just improve it and get better. And then really the rest of this year is aimed towards working with our current clients and prospective clients to really just help improve the platform as much as we can from your feedback. And so we always welcome that. And I'd love to talk to you if you're interested.
Wonderful. That's great, Hannah. Thank you so much. We're just at the bottom of the hour, so all that remains for me to do is thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. We would love your feedback. We would love you to trial Sample Manager. We hope that the information and best practices that Hannah has shared will be insightful and useful. Keep in touch, and we hope to see you again at one of our short webinars in the near future. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Take care.